For most of my life, my name wasn't Clara. That's what it says on my birth certificate, but it wasn't who I was. For 22 years, my name was Mom. And for the first 12 of those years, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. My world, you see, was a universe of two, orbiting a tiny, brilliant star named Lily. Her father had been a brief, charming chapter who left before the book was even properly written, leaving me with a story to finish on my own. And I dedicated myself to it completely. My life became a series of sacrifices, but I never called them that. They were just choices. I chose the night shift cleaning offices so I could be there to walk her to school in the morning. I chose worn-out shoes so she could have the brand-name sneakers all the other kids wore. I chose staying in on Friday nights, mending her clothes and helping with her dioramas over having any kind of social life of my own. My hands were perpetually chapped from bleach, and my back ached with a permanent, dull throb, but my heart was full. Our little apartment, with its mismatched furniture and the constant scent of lemon-scented cleaner, was a sanctuary. It was where I wasn't Clara, the exhausted cleaning lady. I was Mom, the creator of blanket forts, the healer of scraped knees, the keeper of all secrets. My routine was a liturgy of love. The 5 a.m. alarm, the quiet hour before she woke where I'd pack her lunch, always cutting the crusts off her sandwich and drawing a little smiley face on her napkin. The walk to school, her small hand tucked into mine, her chatter filling the morning air with stories of dreams and playground politics. The long hours at work, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans, my mind always on her. Did she eat her lunch? Was she kind to the new girl? Did she remember her jacket? And then, the best part of the day, picking her up, her face lighting up when she saw me, a beacon in the sea of other parents. That single, radiant smile was my fuel. It made the aching muscles, the condescending bosses, and the lonely nights all worth it. I lived for that smile. I lived for the weight of her head on my lap as we watched cartoons, for the sound of her breathing down the hall as she slept. She was my masterpiece. Every good grade she got felt like my accomplishment. Every ribbon she won in track felt like my victory. My identity was so completely interwoven with hers that I couldn't see where Clara ended and Mom began. There was no seam. We were one. That's why I remember the day the seam was ripped open with such brutal clarity. It wasn't a single, violent tear, but a slow, deliberate unraveling that began on a sunny Saturday afternoon at the school's annual spring fair. Lily was 12. It was a time of transition, a shaky bridge between childhood and the terrifying, self-conscious world of being a teenager. Her friends were changing. They were girls from the nicer side of town, girls whose mothers drove pristine SUVs and wore clothes that weren't from a discount store. I saw the way Lily looked at them, and then at me, in my practical, faded jeans and the free t-shirt from a cleaning supply company I wore because it was comfortable. I felt a prickle of insecurity, but pushed it down. I was her mom. That was all that mattered. We were walking through the crowded schoolyard, the air thick with the smell of popcorn and freshly cut grass. I'd just bought her a snow cone, the bright red syrup already staining her lips. She was laughing with her friends, Chloe and Jessica, and for a moment, everything was perfect. Then, Chloe's mother, a tall, elegant woman named Mrs. Davis, walked over. She had a perfectly smooth blonde bob and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "There you are, Chloe," she said, her voice like wind chimes. "Oh, and Lily. Having fun?" She looked at me, a polite but blank expression on her face. "You must be Lily's mother." I smiled, extending a hand that I suddenly wished wasn't so rough and calloused.
I'm Clara.
"It's so nice to meet you." But before she could take my hand, Lily stepped slightly forward, almost creating a barrier between us. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the fair like a shard of glass. "Just call her Clara," she said, not looking at me. Mrs. Davis's polite smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She registered the coldness, the correction. An awkward silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Chloe and Jessica exchanged a quick, uncomfortable glance. In that moment, the entire world seemed to zoom in on that one horrifying sentence. Just call her Clara. Not, "This is my mom, Clara." Just
Clara.
a name, a label for a person she happened to live with. I felt the blood drain from my face. The sun felt cold. The cheerful noise of the fair became a dull roar in my ears. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. Lily didn't look at me. She just kept her eyes fixed on her friends, a strained, artificial smile plastered on her face, as if she'd just performed a difficult but necessary social maneuver. I was no longer Mom. In that public space, in front of her new, important friends, I had been demoted. I was an embarrassment, a secret to be managed. The rest of the day is a blur of pain. I remember walking home in silence, the uneaten snow cone melting in its paper cup. I remember the way she avoided my eyes, the way she shut her bedroom door with a quiet click that felt like a vault ceiling.
I didn't yell. I didn't cry, not then.
I just stood in the hallway of our little apartment, the place that had been my sanctuary, and felt like a ghost. I had been erased. The name that had defined me, the name that was the entire purpose of my existence, had been taken away. At that moment, my world fell apart. It was the deepest pain I'd ever felt. If you've ever gone through a great disappointment and understand what it's like to have your heart broken, please like this video so I know I'm not alone on this journey. The decade that followed was a slow, quiet descent into darkness. The spring fair wasn't a one-time event. It was the beginning of a new rule. The word Mom was officially retired from public use. At parent-teacher conferences, she'd introduce me as Clara. When friends called the landline, she'd say, "One moment, I'll get Clara for you." Each time she did it, it was a fresh cut, a new twist of the knife in a wound that never healed. Soon, the rule bled into the privacy of our own home. It started subtly. She'd call for me from her room, shouting Clara instead of Mom. At first I'd pretend not to hear, waiting for the word I craved, but it never came. My name, my real name, became a symbol of her rejection. It felt like an insult. The silence in our apartment grew heavy, thick with unspoken resentment and my own cavernous sorrow. I was adrift. The singular purpose that had driven me for so long was gone. I was still packing her lunches, still washing her clothes, still working my fingers to the bone to provide for her, but I was doing it as Clara, the live-in service provider. I was a function, not a mother. My grief was a physical presence, a heavy cloak I couldn't take off. I started making mistakes at work. I'd forget to lock an office, or miss a spot on the floor, my mind perpetually lost in a fog of hurt. Eventually, after a few warnings, I was let go. Finding another job was hard. I was in my 40s, my only real work experience being low-wage manual labor. The financial strain added a new layer of desperation to my emotional despair. We went from having little to having almost nothing. The power was shut off a few times. Dinners became simple, repetitive meals of pasta or rice. Through it all, Lily seemed to retreat further into her own world of school, friends, and a burgeoning teenage life from which I was completely excluded. She seemed to blame me for our poverty, for the shame she felt, the shame that had made her erase me in the first place. I had hit the bottom. I remember one particular night, sitting in the dark because I couldn't pay the electricity bill, staring at the flickering candlelight dancing on the walls. Lily was at a friend's house, a friend with a big, warm, brightly lit home. I was utterly alone, a complete and total failure. My daughter was ashamed of me. I couldn't hold a job, and I couldn't even keep the lights on. The thought that my life was over wasn't a dramatic, fleeting notion. It felt like a simple, logical conclusion. What was the point of Clara? It was in that pit of despair, rummaging through a box of old things to see if I had anything worth selling, that the spark appeared. The box was in the back of my closet, filled with dusty remnants of a life before Lily, a life I had almost forgotten. There were a few faded paperbacks, some letters from my own mother who had passed away years ago, and a collection of old photographs. My fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound photo album. Inside were pictures of my parents, my grandparents, people I barely remembered. And near the back, I found it, a small, black and white photograph of my mother, a young woman with a smile that mirrored my own, holding a baby wrapped in a soft blanket. That baby was me. But the photo was damaged. A long crease ran right through my mother's face, and a water stain had bleached out a corner of the image, making it look like the memory itself was fading away. I traced the crack with my finger, a profound sadness washing over me. This was my history, my connection to a time when I was someone's everything, just as Lily had been mine. And it was broken. Right then, a strange, forgotten memory surfaced. It was of my grandmother, sitting at her kitchen table with tiny brushes and pots of pigment, leaning over a photograph with the intense focus of a surgeon. She used to restore old, damaged family pictures. She called it giving memories a second chance. She had tried to teach me once, but I was a restless teenager with no patience for such delicate work. But sitting there in the dark, holding the broken image of my mother, I felt a sudden, desperate urge to fix it. Not to sell it, but for me. It was a foolish idea. I had no tools, no knowledge, no skill. But the next day, I took the last $20 I had to my name and went to a small art supply store. I bought a few tiny brushes, some basic photosafe inks, and a magnifying glass. That night, at my kitchen table, I began the painstaking process of trying to heal that photograph. I worked for hours, my back aching and my eyes straining. My first attempts were clumsy, a shaky hand making the crease look worse. But I didn't stop. For the first time in years, my mind was not consumed with my own pain. It was focused. I was thinking about color, about shadow, about the precise, microscopic work of bringing a faded image back to life. After 3 nights of relentless, obsessive work, I finished. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. But my mother's face was whole again. Her smile was no longer fractured. I had taken something broken and, with my own hands, I had mended it. Looking at the restored photograph, a fragile, unfamiliar feeling flickered within me. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something smaller, quieter. It was a flicker of purpose. In restoring the image of my mother, I had, in some small way, begun to restore a piece of myself. The piece that was just Clara. That tiny spark, born from a cracked photograph at my kitchen table, refused to go out. I started looking for other broken things. I found more damaged photos in the old box. I went to flea markets and bought shoeboxes full of strangers' forgotten, faded memories for $1. Each one was a puzzle, a challenge. I learned through relentless trial and error. I spent hours at the library, poring over old books on photo restoration and chemical processes. I watched countless free tutorials online, pausing and rewinding, mimicking the movements of experts with my cheap brushes. My kitchen table became a laboratory of revival. There were so many failures. I ruined a beautiful tintype by using the wrong solution, watching in horror as the image dissolved before my eyes. I spent a week on a wedding portrait from the 1940s only to have my hand slip at the last moment, leaving a tiny black streak across the bride's veil. Each mistake was a stab of frustration, but each one taught me something. And I kept going, driven by a need I didn't fully understand. I was breathing life back into moments that time had tried to erase. In a way, I was doing for these pictures what I couldn't do for myself. My first real breakthrough came from my elderly neighbor, Mr. Henderson. He saw me working through my apartment window one evening and knocked on my door, holding a tattered, torn photograph of his late wife. It had been in his wallet for 50 years, and it was barely recognizable. He asked, his voice trembling, if there was anything I could do. He didn't have much money, but he'd pay what he could. I worked on that photograph for 2 weeks, treating it with more reverence than I had ever treated anything. I digitally scanned the pieces, painstakingly stitched them together on a borrowed computer, and then spent days meticulously retouching every crack, every spot, every fold. When I showed him the final restored print, he just stared at it, his eyes filling with tears. "That's her," he whispered. "That's my Eleanor." He held my hands, his own wrinkled ones shaking, and he thanked me with a sincerity that resonated deep in my soul. He paid me $30, but the look on his face was worth $1 million. That was my first victory. It was the first time in over a decade that I had felt truly seen, not as a failure or a ghost, but as someone who could create something of value, someone who could bring comfort. Mr. Henderson told a friend at his church. That friend told another. Slowly, word began to spread through the community. "Clara," they'd say, "the woman who fixes memories." I made business cards at the library. Clara's Restorations, giving her memories a second chance. I started with small jobs, restoring photos for birthdays and anniversaries. My work was my salvation. It was my therapy. With every family, I helped reconnect with their past. I was building my own future. The trickle of work became a steady stream. I was able to pay the electricity bill on time. Then the rent. I bought better equipment. My reputation grew beyond the local neighborhood. A blogger who wrote about local artisans discovered my work and wrote a feature on me. She called me the memory keeper. The story went viral in our small city. Suddenly, I was getting emails and calls from all over the state. My kitchen table was no longer big enough. I took a huge leap of faith and used my meager savings to rent a tiny, dusty studio space above a bookstore downtown. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first time I turned the key in that lock, I felt a sense of ownership and pride I hadn't felt in years. I was Clara, a business owner. Lily, now in her late teens, watched all of this with a quiet, unreadable distance. She saw the new equipment arriving, saw me leaving for the studio every morning. She noticed that the fridge was always full now, that the lights never went out. But the wall between us remained. She never asked about my work. She never set foot in my studio. I was still Clara to her. But something had shifted in me. My self-worth was no longer tied to the name she refused to give me. It was being built, piece by piece, in that little room filled with the ghosts of other people's lives. My work became more ambitious. The local historical society commissioned me to restore a collection of glass plate negatives documenting the city's founding. It was a massive, daunting project. For months, I was immersed in the 19th century, cleaning and repairing images of people whose names were on our street signs, bringing the city's own memory back to life. The project culminated in an exhibition at the City Museum. There was an opening night, with local press and city officials. And my name was on the wall, in big, vinyl letters. Restoration by Clara Vance. Seeing my name like that under the bright gallery lights was overwhelming. I wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. I was being recognized for a skill I had forged from my own pain. People came up to me, shaking my hand, telling me how incredible the work was. They didn't know me as a cleaner or a failed mother. They knew me as an artist, an archivist. I was the author of the success. It was there, with my own hands, that I began to rewrite my story. I stopped being the victim and became the author of my own destiny. If my journey of overcoming is inspiring you, subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters and be a part of this community of new beginnings. The years continued to pass. My business thrived. I hired an assistant. Clara's Restorations became a well-respected name in historical preservation circles. I gave talks at universities and workshops at community centers. I had built a life for myself, a full, meaningful life that was entirely my own. Lily went off to college to study journalism, funded in part by the business she never acknowledged. We spoke on the phone, our conversations polite and superficial, always about her studies, her friends, her life. I was still Clara. The word "mom" was a ghost that haunted the phone lines between us. Then the email arrived. It was an invitation to her university graduation. I stared at it for a long time. Of course, I would go. But I went with no expectations. I would be a face in the crowd, a silent witness. I would be Clara, the financial provider, sitting in the audience. I bought a new dress, a simple but elegant navy blue one. It was the first time I had spent that much money on myself without a pang of guilt. I drove the 3 hours to her university town, checked into a hotel, and felt a strange sense of calm. I had my own life now. Her approval, while still something I yearned for in the deepest part of my heart, no longer felt like a necessity for my survival. The day of the ceremony was bright and hot. I found a seat in the vast auditorium and watched as the graduates filed in, a sea of black robes and hopeful faces. I spotted Lily. She looked so grown up, so poised. When they announced she had won the Dean's Medal for Journalism, the highest honor in her faculty, I felt a surge of pride so intense it took my breath away. She walked to the podium to give a short address.
My heart hammered in my chest.
She looked out at the audience, her eyes scanning the crowd. For a fleeting second, her eyes met mine. She began to speak. She talked about stories, about the power of narratives, about who gets to tell them, and which ones get forgotten. We are all a collection of stories, she said, her voice clear and strong. The ones we tell ourselves, and the ones that are told about us. For a long time, I tried to tell a very simple story about myself. A story of success, of ambition, of leaving a small town behind. She paused, taking a breath. But it was a story with a huge piece missing. It was a story built on a lie of omission. My hands grew cold. I didn't know where this was going. The most important story in my life is not my own, she continued, her voice wavering slightly. It's the story of a woman who built a universe for me, and how I, in my childish shame and arrogance, tried to tear it down. The auditorium was silent. I could feel the eyes of the people around me, wondering who she was talking about. When I was 12, I did something terribly cruel. I was ashamed of where I came from, and I took that shame out on the one person who had only ever shown me unconditional love. I took away her name. I decided she would just be Clara. Because I thought the name Mom didn't fit with the story I wanted to tell about myself. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and silent. I was barely breathing. For 10 years, she said, her voice cracking, I held on to that cruelty. And in that time, while I was so busy trying to write my own story, Clara was rewriting hers. She lost her job. We had nothing. And from the absolute ashes of the life I helped destroy, she found a forgotten photograph and, with her own 2 hands, she built a new world. She became an artist, a historian, a business owner. She became the person who restores memories for everyone else, while I refused to acknowledge our own. She looked directly at me then, her eyes shining with tears. Today, I'm receiving an award for telling stories. But the greatest storyteller I know is in this audience. And I would be nothing without her. So, I can't accept this medal alone. She looked at the dean. I'd like to invite my mom to the stage. The world stopped. A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. An usher appeared at the end of my row, gesturing to me. My legs felt like they were made of stone. I walked down the aisle, up the steps, and onto that bright stage, feeling the weight of 1,000 pairs of eyes. Lily met me at the podium. She didn't say anything. She just wrapped her arms around me, burying her face in my shoulder, and for the first time in a decade, I heard the word I had longed for, whispered in my ear. Mom, she sobbed. I'm so sorry, Mom. She pulled back, took the medal from the dean, and placed it around my neck. The auditorium erupted in applause, a thunderous, rolling wave of it. But all I could hear was that one beautiful word. We drove home together after the ceremony. We didn't talk much in the car, but the silence was different. It wasn't heavy and cold anymore. It was light, peaceful, full of things that no longer needed to be said. When we got back to my apartment, she asked if she could see the studio. It was the first time she had ever asked. I walked her over, my key turning in the lock of the place I had built from my broken heart. She stepped inside and just looked around at the shelves of chemicals, the specialized scanners, the photographs in various states of repair pinned to the walls. She walked over to my workbench and picked up the first photo I ever restored, the cracked picture of my mother holding me. I had kept it there all these years as a reminder. This is where it started, she asked softly. I nodded, unable to speak. You saved yourself, she said, more to herself than to me. I spent all this time thinking I needed to save myself from you, from our life. But you are the one who is actually doing it. That night, she called me Mom again. And she has every day since. But something inside me has fundamentally changed. The name is a gift, a joy, but it is no longer my entire identity. My life is not just about being her mother anymore. It's about my work, my art, the legacy I am building. My peace comes not from her acceptance, but from my own. It comes from the quiet satisfaction of a difficult restoration completed, from the gratitude in a client's eyes, from the knowledge that I stood in the rubble of my life, and I built something beautiful and strong with my own 2 hands. My name is Clara, and I am also proudly a mom. The 2 names no longer fight for space. They coexist, each one making the other stronger. Today, I understand that the wounds of the past don't define who we are, but what we do with them, yes.